growing seed, something you have to nurture even when you can't see it sprouting. But I didn't always understand that, and for a long time, I didn't try to. The room remained still, captivated by the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. Lily, still clutching her Bible, didn't move, her wide eyes fixed on him, waiting. There were times, Trump admitted, when I lost that faith. Life gets complicated, and you start questioning everything, your choices, your beliefs, even whether God is really there at all. I've had moments where I felt completely alone, even in the middle of a crowd like this. Have you ever felt that way? He looked directly at Lily, his gaze searching. Lily nodded slowly. Sometimes, she whispered, the single word carrying the weight of every doubt, every quiet prayer she'd ever whispered into the dark. Trump inhaled deeply, nodding as if he understood all too well. Yeah, me too, he said. But you know what I've learned? Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about holding on, even when you don't. It's about believing that even in your hardest moments, you're not really alone. A hushed murmur swept through the crowd, a mix of astonishment and quiet understanding. It was rare to see him speak this way, not as a politician, not as a billionaire, but as a man who had wrestled with doubt and had come through the other side. He looked back at Lily. That Bible you're holding, it's special, isn't it? She nodded again. It was my grandma's. He smiled softly. Then you already know. Faith isn't something you hold in your hands. It's something you carry in your heart. And sometimes, even when you don't feel it, it's still there. The silence stretched for another beat before the room erupted, not with the usual political applause, but with something deeper. People wiped their eyes, exchanged glances, and for the first time that evening, the energy in the hall wasn't about policies or power. It was about something far more profound. Lily, satisfied with his answer, gave a small, shy smile. She turned back to her mother, who squeezed her hand tightly, pride shining in her eyes. And in that moment, a crowded town hall had become something else entirely. It had become a place of honesty, reflection, and perhaps just a little bit of faith regained. God is the reason I keep climbing, even when I don't know where the next step leads. He's the voice that reminds me to keep going, even when I'm afraid I'll fall. And he's the presence that never left me, even when I turned my back on him. A hush settled over the room, heavier than before, yet filled with something unspoken, something deeper than politics, deeper than personal beliefs. The weight of his words wasn't just heard, it was felt. Lily blinked, her small fingers loosening their grip on the Bible. For the first time that evening, she exhaled, as if something in her heart had finally found peace. Trump took a slow breath, then continued, I used to think faith was about being strong all the time, about having all the answers. But the truth is, faith is about admitting when you don't. It's about believing even when it's hard. And it's about understanding that we're not in control of everything, but we are never alone in it either. The audience sat in complete stillness. Some had misty eyes, others had bowed their heads, lost in quiet thought. It wasn't the fiery speech they had expected. It was something far more intimate. Lily shifted slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. So, you do believe? Trump's expression softened, something almost fatherly in the way he looked at her. I do, he said simply. Not because I've always understood God, but because, in my hardest moments, he understood me. A tear slipped down Lily's cheek, but this time, she didn't wipe it away. She only nodded, as if she had found the answer she had been searching for all along. The silence was finally broken, not by loud applause, but by something more meaningful. A murmur of quiet prayers. A few soft amens. A sense that, for a brief moment, everyone in that hall, regardless of their beliefs, their politics, or their doubts, had been reminded of something bigger than themselves. Trump straightened slightly, exhaling as he glanced back at the audience. And maybe that's what faith really is, he added. Not about proving we're right, not about knowing everything, but about finding the strength to ask the hardest questions and being brave enough to listen for the answers. Lily gave a small, grateful smile. And in that moment, it was clear, this wasn't just a political town hall anymore. It was a conversation that none of them would ever forget. He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. Trump's voice carried across the silent room, each word settling like a heavy weight on the hearts of those listening. Lily's eyes shimmered again, but this time, her tears did not fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, her small hands gripping her grandmother's worn Bible as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Something inside her had changed, not just a feeling, but an understanding. Just as the moment seemed to settle, as if the very air had absorbed the weight of Trump's words, a hand slowly rose from the back of the room. A murmur passed through the crowd as heads turned toward the man standing near the rear of the hall. He was an ordinary man, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second thought. His face was lined with years of hard work, his hands calloused, his posture steady yet hesitant. A mechanic, perhaps. A father. Maybe someone who had once attended church faithfully but had drifted away, only showing up on the occasional Sunday when life allowed. But when he spoke, his voice cut through the stillness like a bell. "Mr. Trump," he began, his tone slow and deliberate. "I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder, do you think part of the problem is that most of us are too afraid to admit we're struggling?" The question hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. Trump blinked, caught slightly off guard. It was the kind of question that couldn't be brushed aside with a rehearsed response. For the first time in a long while, he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the man, his expression shifting, not into one of authority, but something more introspective. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the podium as he gathered his thoughts. Then, in a voice softer than before, he spoke. "He's the reason I keep going, even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times." Trump's words hung in the air, the weight of them pressing down on the silent room. Lily's eyes shimmered again, but this time, no tears fell. Instead, she straightened her small frame, gripping her grandmother's Bible with both hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Something inside her had changed, not just an emotion, but an understanding. For a brief moment, the room was still, as if holding its breath. Then, a hand rose near the back. A murmur swept through the audience as heads turned toward the man standing. He was an ordinary figure, someone you might pass on the street without a second glance. His face was rugged, lined with years of hard work. Perhaps a mechanic. A father. Maybe the kind of man who went to church when life allowed but never spoke much about faith. But when he spoke, his voice cut through the quiet like a bell. "Mr. Trump," he said, his words slow, deliberate. "I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder, have we all been too afraid to admit that we're struggling? Do you think that's part of the problem?" The question landed heavily. For a moment, Trump seemed caught off guard. But only for a moment. He leaned slightly forward, resting his hands on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. "You know," he began, his voice steady, "I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy. It's complicated. And sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void." He paused, letting the words settle. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trying even when you don't. The man nodded, his expression softening. Slowly, he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Then another voice spoke. Soft, but clear. "My grandma used to say, faith is like planting seeds." Lily's voice carried through the room, her small frame now steady. "You don't always see them grow right away. But you have to believe they will." A hush fell over the audience. Trump smiled, genuine, almost tender. His usual guarded demeanor seemed to shift, if only for a moment. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said. "And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there. Growing. In ways you can't see. Something in the air changed. People weren't just listening anymore. They were connecting. Heads turned. Soft glances were exchanged. Some whispered to the person beside them. What had begun as a structured town hall was now something much deeper. A shared reflection on life's struggles, doubts, and, most of all, grace. Then, another hand rose. This time, it was an older woman. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun. When she spoke, her voice trembled. "I lost my husband last year," she said. "I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again?" A thick silence settled over the room. Trump stepped forward, closer to the edge of the stage. His voice, when he spoke, was softer now, but steady. "It's never too late," he said. "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, it finds its way back to you." The woman nodded. Tears glistened in her eyes. And she wasn't the only one. All around the room, people sat in reflective silence. Some dabbed at their faces with tissues. Others simply looked down, lost in thought. But something had changed. This wasn't just a conversation anymore. It was something far more personal. A moment of truth, of connection. And what came next would only deepen that bond. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping over the audience. "You know," he said, "if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones. The times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the young girl. "This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about. It's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads." Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made the girl's smile widen just a little more. Trump's tone grew firmer. "We're living in a time where it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences." He let the words hang for a moment. "But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look." A ripple of applause started. Soft at first, then stronger. People stood, clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for Lily's courage, for the honesty that had filled the room. As the applause finally subsided, Trump leaned in one last time. "So tonight, I'll leave you with this." The crowd quieted, waiting. Ask yourselves what faith really means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, even if it's uncertain. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing. A pause. A breath. And if something touched you tonight, hold on to it. Let it grow. And share it with someone who needs it most. The applause returned, even louder this time. But more than that, something else had shifted. Hugs were exchanged. Handshakes. Even tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with polite nods now lingered, talking, sharing, connecting. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by hope. Lily, still standing beside her mother, watched as Trump stepped away from the podium. He walked toward her, kneeling slightly, so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now. "For answering." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to the crowd one last time. As he exited, the room remained alive with quiet conversations, people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but certain. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes, the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find the pieces of ourselves we didn't even know were missing. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on your own faith and share it with someone who might need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and bring us closer together.